Welcome to the deep dive. Today, we're venturing into a really fascinating and, frankly, complex story right here in California.
Hmm.
Specifically, we're looking at the Venice Shoreline Crips, or VSLC.
Yeah,
So forget the skate parks and the boardwalk performers for a minute. We're going to go much deeper into the history, the evolution of this specific gang set.
absolutely. And what's immediately striking about the Venice Shoreline Crips, I think, is how deeply their story is embedded in the unique history of Venice itself, specifically the Oakwood neighborhood.
Right.
This isn't a group that just, popped up out of nowhere. Its origins are really tied to the place.
Okay, so to get that, we need to rewind a bit. Back to the founding of Venice by Abbot Kinney.
Yeah, yeah.
He designated Oakwood as a servant zone. Now that sounds, well, discriminatory, and it was, but it sort of inadvertently created this pocket.
A space where Black individuals actually had a rare chance to own property near the California coast.
Exactly. Which was, almost unheard of elsewhere at the time. That's a really crucial starting point, isn't it?
It really is. Because then you have these restrictive covenants, legal tools, basically designed to segregate housing.
Uh-huh.
They effectively cemented Oakwood as this key settlement area for Black families. And the community grew quite a bit in the 1930s and 40s.
Why then specifically?
A lot of it was driven by jobs in the nearby oil fields, which were booming back then.
Okay, oil fields. But here's where the story shifts a bit. By the 1950s, despite this history of Black homeownership, Oakwood was facing some serious neglect.
Yeah, the descriptions from that time are pretty stark. Some sources call it the Ghetto by the Sea.
Ghetto by the sea. Wow, that paints a picture.
It really does. It points to, unpaved streets, rundown bungalows, maybe lacking proper foundations, just real hardship, even with that coastal location.
Right, so you have this really specific mix of historical circumstances and economic conditions.
Exactly. And it's really from that environment, that specific socioeconomic context, that the story of the Venice Shoreline Crips starts to, emerge.
Because the oil fields eventually declined.
Right. Jobs dried up, adversity increased, and then layer onto that the racial tensions heating up in the 1960s.
And the Black Power movement.
And the Black Power movement, exactly. A very potent mix.
Okay, so let's trace that connection more directly. We know there was already a gang presence in Oakwood, Venice 13.
313, yeah.
Yeah.
An older Hispanic gang.
So how did the Shoreline Crips emerge from or relate to that structure and these bigger social currents?
Well, the thinking is, within Venice 13 during the 60s, you had these rising racial tensions nationally, plus the ideas of the Black Power movement, self-determination, Black pride, really resonating with younger Black members.
So, okay.
At the same time, just across town in South Central, you have the original Crips gangs forming, Raymond Washington, Tookie Williams. That energy.
Right, the foundational Crip.
That whole ethos is sort of filtered over. It influenced a faction within V13, younger Black members, who eventually broke away.
And they identified as Shoreline Crips.
Yes, aligning themselves with that broader Crip identity, which initially had this focus on, community protection, Black empowerment, that kind of thing.
So those early days, it sounds like, had a bit more of a political edge, or at least a connection to social consciousness.
Arguably, yes. More so than what came later.
Because then the 1980s hit. And that seems to be a major turning point, a big shift in focus.
Oh, absolutely. The arrival and explosion of crack cocaine in the 80s it fundamentally changed the game for gangs everywhere.
How's it so for the Shorelines?
Well, for VSLC, like many others, those earlier political or community motivations, they largely faded into the background.
Replaced by
Money. Pursuit of financial gain through the drug trade became paramount. The Shorelines got heavily involved in dealing narcotics.
Where specifically? Still just Oakwood?
Centered in Oakwood, yeah, but they also expanded their operations onto the Venice Boardwalk. Very public, very busy area.
Right. And that shift towards drug dealing, that must have cranked up the conflicts, right? Setting the stage for the 90s.
Definitely. The sources detail some really intense rivalries in the 1990s. A major one was the war with Culver City 13.
Okay, CC13, what kicked that off?
It seems to revolve around territory, specifically the Mar Vista Gardens housing projects. The Shorelines had apparently gained a presence there.
Uh-huh.
But Culver City 13 pushed them out. And this wasn't just like a minor disagreement. No, it ignited this really fierce, drawn-out conflict. Sources talk about nightly gunfire becoming almost routine for residents there. It was bad.
Wow. Just constant fear. Shows how vital territory was.
Absolutely. Control of turf, especially for the drug trade.
And speaking of conflict, Wasn't there also trouble within the Venice gangs? Between the Shorelines and their predecessors, Venice 13?
Yes. If that external war wasn't enough, they also ended up in conflict with V13.
What was that about? Still drugs?
Largely, yes. You have to think about how incredibly profitable the drug market in Venice could be. So it boiled down to a battle for dominance over that local trade.
An internal power struggle.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And it got very violent, apparently threatening to destabilize the whole area, until eventually some kind of truce or ceasefire was worked out.
It really paints a picture of how economic forces can just completely redirect a group's path.
It really does. Warp it, almost.
Now, around this same time, the 80s and 90s, Venice itself is changing, right? Demographically.
Yeah, big time. You start seeing more and more white homeowners moving into the area, gentrification starting to take hold.
And how did that influx affect the Shoreline Crips and the situation on the ground?
Well, it certainly increased pressure on the authorities, on the LAPD, to do something about the very visible gang problem.
So what do they do?
The sources mention a range of tactics. Lots of police raids targeting suspected gang members, and significantly, the use of gang injunctions.
Explain those quickly.
Sure, they're basically civil court orders. They identify specific individuals as gang members and then restrict their activities within certain designated areas, like they can't associate with other known members, maybe there are curfews, stuff like that.
The idea being to disrupt their operations.
Right, to make it harder for the gang to function and control public spaces.
Okay, so you have this pressure from law enforcement, changing demographics. But despite all that, the Venice Shoreline Crips seem to have been pretty resilient.
Remarkably so, yeah. Our sources consistently suggest they've maintained control over their core territory.
And their numbers.
Membership seems to have remained fairly steady, often cited in the hundreds.
So why? Why this persistence despite everything?
That's the million-dollar question, isn't it?
Yeah.
It suggests that just cracking down with law enforcement doesn't necessarily fix the root causes.
Like what?
Could be many things. Deep social ties within the Oakwood community, maybe. Intergenerational involvement in the gang itself. Maybe just a continued lack of, good economic alternatives for young people there.
It definitely raises questions about just using punitive measures.
Without addressing the bigger picture, yeah.
And, there were specific incidents that really brought the VSLC into the public eye, weren't there? Put them on the map, so to speak.
There were. One really notable one was in November 1980, the murder of Sarai Ribikoff.
She was the niece of Senator Abraham Ribikoff.
That's right. She was killed during a robbery outside a restaurant on Washington Boulevard, and a Venice Crip member was arrested and convicted for it.
That must have caused a huge stir.
Absolutely. Given the family connection, it brought national attention to gang violence in Venice, probably amplified the pressure on police and politicians significantly.
And the war with the Culver City Boyz we mentioned earlier, that had wider impacts too, right? Beyond just the gang members.
Oh, for sure. The sources make it clear that the violence wasn't contained. Innocent bystanders, parents, people with zero connection to the gangs, they're getting caught in the crossfire.
So caught up in it.
Yeah. It highlights that pervasive fear, the insecurity that these kinds of conflicts create for the whole community. It's not just about the people pulling triggers.
Absolutely. Okay, so as we start to wrap up this deep dive,
right,
we've really traced the arc of the Venice Shoreline Crips. From their unique origins in Oakwood, this neighborhood shaped by, segregation, but also Black property ownership.
Right, that unusual start.
Through their evolution, marked by first the influence of social movements, then that huge shift with the drug trade.
Leading to intense conflicts, both external and internal.
And then their resilience, their persistence, despite significant police efforts and the changing face of Venice itself.
Exactly. It's a really potent case study, isn't it? It shows that complex interplay of history, inequality, economics, social movements, the drug trade, all these forces shaping a gang's trajectory.
And the community around it.
And the community, absolutely. It's a reminder. These things are rarely simple. They're often deeply, deeply rooted.
Which kind of brings us to a final thought, maybe something for our listeners to chew on.
Okay.
When you consider this whole intricate web, we've talked about the legacy of segregation, the economic roller coaster, the social movements, the destructive impact of drugs, all shaping the VSLC and Oakwood. What does their story ultimately tell us about the deep roots, the enduring challenges of gang activity in our cities, not just back then, but maybe even today?
That's a heavy question.
It is. It's a lot to think about. Hopefully this deep dive has given folks some valuable insights into what is truly a unique and complex piece of California history.